the anti-immigration protests in Knowsley, outside Liverpool, another small town that's being targeted by the far right. There's a protest against, and I think they tried to set the immigration centre on fire, and lo and behold, the far right are mobilising. And the left have this sort of thing, it was like, why doesn't someone organise people in Knowsley? Why don't we organise in Knowsley? And I was like, well, you've got to live there.
Britain is obsessed with class, possibly more than any other country in the world. And the left, naturally, is also obsessed with class. It's central to our politics. But I've had a suspicion for quite a while that we don't quite get it right when it comes to understanding class in the 21st century. Something's missing in our analysis. And a book has been published which has crystallized much of my own thinking. It said things I wanted to say. It is called A Nation of Shopkeepers, The Unstoppable Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie. Its author is Dan Evans, and Dan is today's guest on Downstream. Dan Evans, welcome.
Thank you for having me, mate.
We are talking today about your brilliant book, A Nation of Shopkeepers, The Unstoppable Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie. It sounds quite pointy-headed. It is a little bit, but I think the political takeaways from it are anything but. Before we start with the book and its contents, you're from a place called Porthcawl in South Wales. At the top of the book, you talk about Porthcawl. You embed the analysis in your upbringing, fundamentally. What is Porthcawl like? So, yeah,
Porthcawl is obviously extremely special to me, and I forget sometimes that not everyone loves or knows as much about Porthcawl as I do. So it's a small tourist town in between Cardiff and Swansea. In South Wales, it traditionally occupied a very special place in the sort of imaginary because it was the venue for the South Wales Miners' Eisteddfod. Actually, one of the biggest caravan parks in Europe, fun fair. But gradually, this sort of town got gentrified, and it became seen locally as I write in the book, it's like a posh or aspirational middle class town. So I grew up thinking I was posh, straightforwardly posh. We used to play football against boys from the valleys, and they would make fun of our accents because I never a particularly strong Welsh accent. Call us posh boys. We had different haircuts. They had crew cuts. I had like long hair back when I had hair, and it was just it. And the rest of Bridgend County tends to vote Labour. Porthcawl is sort of surrounded by former mining villages, but then Porthcawl used to be a coal port, but it's mainly known for tourism. So yeah, everything I sort of have grown up thinking about, because you hear people say about South Wales, South Wales never votes Conservative. I don't know anyone who votes Tory in Wales. And I remember thinking, well, actually, Porthcawl is a solidly Conservative town. I know loads of people who vote Conservative. So my framework for understanding myself was always based on Porthcawl, and it was this idea of Porthcawl as a middle class oasis in a working class area, and obviously that starts to inform how you view yourself. I then go away to university, and everyone in university says, "Oh, he's from the valleys. Porthcawl is valleys on sea. It's not posh." And I was mortally offended. Like what? I thought I was posh, and then I started to think, well, what is the sort of class character of Porthcawl? And then I eventually did a PhD on Porthcawl. And I started to think about the people who were in Porthcawl. They're not properly, not the professional managerial class. They're not properly posh people, doctors and things like that. These are sort of self-made tradesmen. They're people from relatively modest upbringings who've done well and have a lot of money, or a relative lot, seemed like they had a lot of money at the time. And then I started doing my PhD on Porthcawl, national identity in Porthcawl. That's how much I love the place. And then I started to think, well, this is the petty bourgeoisie, because the people who are in Porthcawl, I started to think about their jobs. They were they're self-employed, or they're policemen, or they're soldiers and things like that. They own their own house. Sometimes people own more than one house, and they were renting them out. And so I've often had quite solidly right-wing or conservative views. And obviously these people aren't like the sort of Tories in like the home counties. They're not people who are like aristocrats or things like that. These are people who got tattoos on their arms, people who pay in cash. But nonetheless, are died in the will conservatives. And I started to think, well, actually, Porthcawl, and this is the really the main basis of modern conservatism. And if I can sort of study and explain Porthcawl, then you can explain a lot of what's happened in the UK.
It's a sort of microcosm, isn't it, of the sort of, like you said, the petty bourgeois, and you make it so evocative.
Well,
like, the way you said, like, they pay cash, you write this in the book, and it's like, and I would never pay cash, but like the petty, but my dad loves having a big wad of like 200 quid, because he's a taxi driver, right? It's all cash.
Yeah, and people don't want to pay tax. People don't like the tax man. There's all this sort of really strong, like, libertarian feelings. Like, yeah, I'm not giving money. You know, the state isn't taking my money. And obviously, I grew up working in all these bars owned by small businessmen, and you come into contact with small businessmen, and yeah, absolutely hate the concept of paying with card. You know, cash only. Don't like paying tax.
They're just very liquid in a way that the salariat, who are paid every month into your bank account, it's just a very different.
Yeah, and it was a totally different way of viewing the world, almost like the fetishization of, like, graft. You know, work as much as possible. You know, like, work as much as possible until you drop. People's bodies are given up because they've been on the tools since they were like 16. But, you know, to give your family not just a good life, but like a nice life that you can also sort of show off. So in my PhD, because my background is really in like Bourdieu before I got into like Marxist class analysis proper, and it was all about the sort of cultural signifiers, you know, the aesthetics people had in Porthcawl, you know, and at the moment it's things like astroturf lawns, you know, a lot of crushed grey velvet, you know, grey, and a lot of the things about housing. Very, very different to sort of the aesthetics of the traditional middle classes. You know, I live in Cardiff now, and people have like bohemian wild gardens, you know, like hardwood flooring and things like that. That's the house I live in at the moment.
Wildflowers.
Yeah, exactly. Wildflowers.
And these guys are saying, those are weeds, get rid of them, get the astroturf.
Yeah, exactly. And there was, but people in Porthcawl were, you know, very, very focused on appearances, very focused on aspirations of, you know, no, I'm going to graft, I'm going to buy another house, I'm going to do the house up, I'm going to rent it out. You know, it's not necessarily atavism, but it's like it's this constant striving for status and a lot of status anxiety, because people are terrified about sort of falling down into the working class, because a lot of people, you know, don't come from much money. That's the other thing. Porthcawl is a town built on social mobility. Most of the people I grew up with, no one's parents are from Porthcawl. Everyone's parents are from sort of the rest of South Wales. And it was like people who've done well from the working class parts would aspire to move to Porthcawl. And then obviously the kids get inculcated with that sort of desire for social mobility as well. But I thought, yeah, it's the more I read about the sort of the technical understanding of the petty bourgeoisie and their aesthetics and things like that, I was like, well, this isn't a middle class town. You know, it's definitely not working class. This concept of the petty bourgeoisie explains this phenomenon, this life world, and subsequently the politics that grow out of that so well. And then obviously one thing leads to another, and then I wrote the book. But yeah, almost everything comes from, you know, my understanding of the world or politics is just refracted through my upbringing in Porthcawl, like a lot of people, and I think that helped when I was thinking about things like Brexit, and why people vote Conservative, and because, you know, especially around the Brexit vote, people were often saying, well, it's racism, it's xenophobia and things like that, and I was not going to minimise the presence of those things, but a lot of it was termed in a dislike of bureaucracy, don't like people, don't like the state, don't like people telling the little man, the little producer what to do, sort of arbitrary rules. And I think all those things I used to witness growing up around sort of small tradesmen, those things explain a lot of the power, of modern conservatism.
We will get into that. Important to say, you don't view yourself as part of an expanded new working class precariat. That's the point of the book. We will get to that. It's the meat. But quickly, you sort of hint, again at the top of the book, that you think your PhD was a mistake. It was a waste of time. Now, since then, you've returned to the academy. So presumably you don't think it was a waste of time. Where do you sit on that? Because obviously, you know, I did a PhD too. It's 3 to 4 years of your life. Yeah. And it's potentially lost income. And realistically, there's the earning dividend from it is negligible. That's my personal view. Unless you're doing maybe something like economics or mathematics. So was it a waste of time?
Yeah, good question, actually. When you're in the weeds of your PhD, and obviously once you finished it and once you're on the job market, and realise how competitive it is, I did think it was a waste of time. There's a lot of people now who, I mean, obviously the debate about Mickey Mouse degrees and things like that. It's hypocritical of me to say that on the one hand, because I absolutely loved university and I loved the sort of all the fruits of it. Being able to study is a good thing in itself. The thing that upset me and still upsets me about it, because I don't necessarily think I was sympathetic enough to the plight of people who are experiencing downward social mobility in the book, because it is a really awful experience. You know, when you sort of, you said about the two paths, you know, in school, you're sort of, you know, you're told from a very young age, or you're like academic, you're bookish, you got to do this thing. You can't, you know, you don't do the DT, you're going to do this. And then without knowing it, you sort of get sent to university, and then obviously it turns out that everyone's got a PhD, and, you know, you get 200-300 people applying for lecturer jobs, and it's very difficult to start, especially when you see there's no light at the end of the tunnel. You know, you're just thinking, I'm just constantly applying for jobs, and nothing's going to happen, and I am going to sort of, but I guess a lot of it is about your image you have of yourself, right? I mean, we'll get into this a bit more, but the whole point of social mobility in the UK is it's sort of telling people that you shouldn't stay in your small town, that you are de facto, you know, whether it's you're better than the working class people who stay, or certainly you're different. And so when you're sort of working these, what I thought was a dead end job, I did start to feel particularly despondent about it all. But I had it was interesting studying it. But the problem is that the economy has devalued the thing I studied. It's destroyed the higher education system. It's destroyed. There's now too many people doing PhDs, and I'm not saying I include myself in that. You know, so it's you do tend to feel upset by the sort of sunken the time wasted. And I mean, you know, me and you've spoken about this. Is that you delay your life. You know, you put off. You're losing years of your life in terms of your earnings. You know, I could probably beat my age out, but you know, I should have had a family by now. You should have had children. And there are a lot of people who you just delaying these things that you want. You know, I do want a house and children and all those things, but you end up delaying it for this because of your PhD, under the sort of promise that, hey, you're gonna get to the professional class, and you never end up getting there. And I think that's unfortunately going to become a reality for a lot more people. As I say in the book, there's the amount of graduates now in non-graduate jobs is staggering. You know, I think 4 million, and there's no movement. You know, people aren't moving into graduate jobs. People are just going to be stuck for longer and longer and longer.
And the central question of this book is, politically, how do those people build a broader coalition to change things in their economic interest? The thing you say about downward social mobility, again, I have to say the whole book and the whole hypothesis really resonates with me, because we're similar-ish ages, similar-ish sort of professional choices, I suppose. I remember, and downward social mobility is the story of lower middle class or working class aspirants over the last 15 years. You know, I remember one guy, a good friend of mine who's done very well now, which points to the sort of hypothesis in this book. He was not working class. You know, he was a part of the petty bourgeoisie. I remember him graduating from the LSE with a master's, distinction, had a first-class degree from UCL, and he was doing unpaid internship full-time, and he was working in a bar full-time. And he did all that, and he still couldn't find work. And I remember him being, we lived in bunk beds near Old Street. My girlfriend left me, because I said, yeah, move in, mate. She went loopy. She didn't go loopy, she just thought I was an idiot. And that relationship ended. And I remember him, I bought a tuna sandwich, and he was looking at it longingly, because he literally couldn't afford to buy a sandwich.
That's crazy.
He was, you know, you're living off your tips the last day or two of the week. He probably had like, I don't know what he had, probably a few pita bread, some hummus, and a couple of eggs, and he thought, that'll be my dinner tonight. Now, that was only his experience for like a couple of years, say, but that's incredibly radicalizing.
Of course.
For somebody, and I think his dad was an architect, you know, he came from a pretty solid middle-class family, didn't have enough to really help him out. And that is the experience of so many people, that downward social mobility. And I say he's done well. I mean, I wonder how he feels about me saying all this stuff. He lives in like a 2-bed flat. and they've got two incomes, and they're still nowhere near where their parents would have been at the same age and whatnot. And that is the story, like you say, there's the 4 million people who've not got those jobs they expected. There's millions more who still probably feel like their expectations haven't been met. And you think that'll grow over the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years? Or have we hit an inflection point where actually younger people realize what's going on and realize that this status quo probably isn't going to meet a certain set of expectations?
One of the problems is that people from sort of small towns, working class backgrounds, or what I class as the new petty bourgeoisie, people who are aspirant, upwardly mobile, being told in school, go and do this, go and do this, go and do this, is that you're being told to get into fields which are dominated by what I would call the professional managerial class, people who do have like a lot of money, a lot of sort of privileges, to use a word, people who are very comfortable, people who do have connections in X or Y industry, like say law or academia and things like that. And people are being told to go into these fields, and even if you come from a supportive family, a family who aren't poor, which is a lot of people, that certainly me, I had an extremely supportive family, you realize when you're entering these fields that you have nowhere near the same amount of sort of cultural capital and cachet and advantages that everyone else has. You have no connections. You can't go and live in London for free or whatever. So in a way, people are being set up to fail. Like, it's set up to fail. And there's a tension whereby, on the one hand, I love education, and I think education in itself is a fantastic thing. It's amazing to learn, to be able to read books, to have some time to read, and study a topic you love. But then the reality is that, people are funneled into this system, the sort of, I don't know what to call it, the higher education industrial complex or whatever. The fact is, most sixth forms now, the head teachers want to get kids into university. It's not really like how they're going to do, or the fact that the graduate premium is massively stalling, which it is, with the exceptions of STEM subjects and economics.
But I think that's a really important point. So the numbers on this are, I think for a UK male, the graduate dividend over a career is like 150 grand,
yeah,
which is, it's quite a lot. But in the US, it's like 450 grand. In France and Germany, it's 250 grand. So there is actually also, like you say, it's stalling, but there's also something quite unique about how it's stalling in the UK.
Yeah, massively. And there's also, the internal, the differences within the types of different universities. It's not just the graduate premium or being a graduate. It's, I went to a post-1992 university, or whether you went to a Russell group, or whether you did humanities, or whether you did, English literature and things like that. And increasingly, it's like, if you have gone to a not particularly prestigious university, and if you have done a degree which isn't STEM or economics or things like that, you're probably not going to be that much better off. And in fact, I can't remember the exact stats now, but when I was going through the statistics for the education chapter in the book, is that universities increasingly just reproducing the class structure. So it's not actually giving people social mobility. You'll come out of university in the same sort of class and situation as you were, which is fine if you're going into education for the sake of education. But if you're going to university to get to, as I wanted, to have a nice, comfortable life as an academic, and I genuinely did. Right up to the end of my PhD, I remember thinking, like, I'll finish this soon, and then I'll have a nice tenured lectureship, and I'll wear hush puppies, and I'll have a really nice life. And even as that was sort of falling around, around me, I still sort of kept thinking, this, it'll be different. It'll be different for me. And I think a lot of people think that, I'll be the one who breaks through. But this has always been the case for things like, the media, academia, and being an actor, things like that. But it's now increasingly like that for all that sort of horrible, all-consuming feeling that you said about your friend of downward social mobility, of expectations clashing with reality, of living in terrible rented accommodation, is becoming more and more it's just being normalized, and it's going to last longer and longer. And it's definitely a radicalizing, it's 100% a radicalizing thing. But as the other important thing in the book is that I still think that there's a bit of a difference between the experience of downward social mobility or blocked social mobility and sort of what I would call, just class consciousness. Or my experience as a downwardly mobile graduate was definitely radicalizing for me, as it is for a lot of people. But it's not exactly the same thing as being working class. Yeah.
And you make a great point in the book, and again, it resonated with me so much, of, even if you're downwardly mobile and you're trying to get rent on a house, if your parents are homeowners, they can be guarantors. And I thought, Christ, that's so true. My parents rented all the way through until I think their mid-50s. My dad's now a homeowner. Exactly that happened for me, and it's a huge difference. You say this thing about the axes. I mean, this is so true, isn't it? So, for instance, people would try and break into Hollywood or become a professional footballer, and they would say, "Oh, it's my big break." But now that mindset has just applied to the entire economy. If you want a job in public relations, my big break, £30,000 a year, is as if you're like waiting tables and trying to get a script in a major sort of motion picture. Really, really interesting. Sticking with HE for a second, higher education. What's the role of higher education ideologically under neoliberalism?
I mean, there's a number of ways in which I think HE works ideologically. The first one is that, I mean, as I say in the book, social mobility, we talk about neoliberalism and sort of how capitalism catches on and things like this. Social mobility is, as an ideology is one of the ways in which the system holds itself together. It's the thing that keeps people individualistic. It's the thing that stops people having sort of solidarity with other people. It's the thing that stops people identifying with other people because you want to better yourself and you want to get out of your class situation, X, Y, and Z. So by its nature, the social higher education for the low middle classes plays that role. It inculcates the ideology of social mobility and tells people that social mobility is a good. And then obviously beyond that, then it inculcates other forms of ideology. But I think the main one is social mobility, and this idea that we are different from people who don't go to university. But there's also, I mean, without wanting to get into like culture war stuff, there is obviously, you could argue that the HE sector does have a particular role in sort of inculcating particular ways of thinking about the world and forms of language, ways of being, the cultivation of like a new habitus or whatever Bourgeoisie says, a way of holding yourself, a way of you learn new forms of cultural capital which are going to help you on the job market, and in ways of being which are implicitly not what people who don't go to university, they
alienate you from people who otherwise might share very similar political interests.
Yeah, of course. And then, I mean, I always think when you see people on like left Twitter, I don't like to use left Twitter as like a gauge of anything, but over Christmas, people make the pilgrimage back to their small towns, and people always say like, "Oh, I'm meeting my friends from school," or "I'm talking to my family," and there's always this like oil and water culture clash between like progressive sort of young lefties and then implicitly parochial reactionary people from small towns. Obviously, that is not, graduates are a minority. Obviously, not everyone has that sort of clash because not everyone has to leave their small town. A lot of people stay. But the sad thing is, and I say this in the book, is that gradually, and I'm sure a lot of people will attest this, gradually you end up falling out of touch with people who didn't go to university, and you sort of get split off from them culturally, politically, ideologically, socially. You learn new ways of behaving. It's like when your uni friends meet your friends from home, or and vice versa, and you're always trying to straddle the two worlds in terms of people's expectations and ideology. And when people end up, one of the biggest forms of migration in the UK is the movement of young people from small towns to university towns or cities, and a lot of the time that's a permanent move. They move because they want to be around sort of like-minded people, and it's led to this situation. Well, I don't say like metropolitan sort of elite or whatever, but it's led to the situation where like-minded people with similar politics, similar ideology, similar outlook on life, which started in university, all end up
that's inarguable,
staying in the city.
The way you sort of raised your eyes there, you had to check yourself. Am I going to be cancelled for what I just said? I don't think that's a particularly contentious point. Most people would acknowledge the electoral geography of particularly younger voters, let's say voters under 45, disadvantages Labour or progressive parties because they tend to converge in similar areas. They tend to marry people like them. Again, I'm a classic example. My wife comes from a very similar background to me. She's from Portsmouth. Dad was a bus driver, mum was a seamstress. She went to the LSE. We got married because I was at UCL, she's at LSE. So like people marry like-minded people. So one of the things you take aim at is social mobility. I think people should probably have understood that by now. Here's a quote from the book on social mobility. This would keep them, social mobility, on side and ensure that they identified with the hierarchy rather than throwing their lot in with the lower classes and fomenting revolution. Very radical sounding. After all, people are not inclined to smash a system they think they can get to the top of, and the educational divides ensure that they had a class beneath them to look down on and define themselves against. From the very beginning, social mobility via education was the ideological strategy designed to shore up the status quo. Now, that's the ideology, really, of New Labour.
Of course.
But what you're saying is that is the problem.
Yes, of course.
That is the problem. They're not. This is not an ideology of allies or people on our side. This is the problem.
Yeah, the social mobility, I think, is at the core of so many problems in our society. You know, the core of social mobility is don't rise with your class, it's rise out of your class. Implicit in social mobility is this idea that there are a group of people or areas that you have to leave. It's built into the education system it always has been. So I do like a brief history of the education system in the UK, and right into the Victorian era, when higher education and secondary education start to become normalized, it's not for the bourgeoisie. It's not for the bourgeoisie because they don't need to get anywhere because they're already where they need to be. And the bourgeoisie are defined by ease. They don't have the panic of social climbing or the worry of sort of falling back down into whatever class. But it's the middle classes who've always put a massive amount of huge value on education because it's education that is going to get you up that social ladder. And yeah, I do think that social mobility does stop people identifying with the people below them. It stops people. There's a lot in the book about education, I think, in terms of the splitting people off from one another. But I think a lot of people sort of just, particularly on the left, and myself included, social mobility as a good is taken for granted. But I think it's really pernicious because it's that. I said this already, but it stops you identifying with other people who are in sort of a lower position, or stops you identifying with the working class. But two, it keeps you individualistic. It's a hyper-individualistic way of viewing the world. It's about like the individual climbing the ladder. And yeah, I think that's a Hobsbawm, possibly Hobsbawm quote you read. That
Eric Hobsbawm, yeah. Marxist historian,
he says it's about the middle classes would never smash a system that they thought they could get to the top of. It's and even now, I know social mobility is a lie. I know social mobility isn't working, but I'm still not going to stop thinking, one day I'll get to the top. One day I'll get to the top because what's the alternative? People, and the alternative, unfortunately, is people embracing downward social mobility and realizing that these dreams I had of myself of getting to this particular point aren't going to happen. And that's a brutal and it's a jarring thing to think.
So quickly recapping, this idea of social mobility is really a veneer which legitimizes and reproduces a society of ever exacerbating inequality. You also say, however, which I think slightly conflicts with this, that the era of progressive neoliberalism is collapsing. Now, clearly the era of progressive neoliberalism goes hand in hand with that, like you say, hegemonic idea of social mobility. Everybody broadly thinks it's a good thing. So if the era of progressive neoliberalism is collapsing, does that mean people are sort of less inclined to believe in social mobility, or they think it's a lie or it's a crock? So I suppose I'll reformulate the question. What does this mean that the era of progressive neoliberalism is collapsing? I think,
yeah, good question. I should have thought about that. But more and more people are seeing through the system that doesn't work. Yeah, the difference between maybe our generation and even people 5 years older than us, people who are Gen X, columnists who are obsessed with Blair and New Labour. One of the reasons that New Labour was so popular amongst that generation was for a very brief moment of time, there was real social mobility in the UK. People had let's say the 90s, people had free university for a little bit and then the door sort of slammed shut. The mini bubble of Blairism, because it was an mini economic bubble, and obviously you had like Britpop and things like that. People loved it, but the main reason people love New Labour is because they actually achieved genuine social mobility. A bit like the old grammar school system. Because for the grammar school system actually saw a lot of people, genuinely leave one class and move up to another one. That is obviously not happening anymore. Just the stats on the graduate, the death of the graduate premium, the amount of people who are stuck in sort of non-graduate jobs, and the economy isn't getting any better. And this is, as I argue in the book, one of the reasons that progressive movements around the world are the main social base of these movements are downwardly mobile, very overeducated, arguably overeducated, underemployed graduates, is because they're realizing that this isn't. It's just a lie. It's not. The economy is totally broken, as you guys have pointed out on Novara so many times. It's a massive lie. But the challenge, I think, for us is to sort of, as a left, is to shake off this idea of social mobility, because the problem is that do we want to massively change society? Do we want a revolution? Do we want to overhaul society? Or do we want to actually just make society meritocratic so we can take up our rightful positions in society? And one of the criticisms I have of, I campaigned for Corbyn. I really like Jeremy Corbyn. In fact, I gave him the last copy of my book, actually. So I should have bought my own, but I gave it to him. But I do believe that the motivating factor for a lot of people being involved in progressive movements is not to overthrow the class system. It's not to do away with hierarchy. It's actually to just ensure that we can take up our rightful position. And if you look at some of the strikes that are going on at the moment, they're sort of classic white collar union strikes, and they're a response. It's not a collective response of the working class, in my opinion. It's the response of middle class or aspirational people who want to restore the status they've lost, and that is something very different from like a working class union, for example.
Sorry to interrupt a brilliant conversation. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am, but this is really important. In order to solve some of the fundamental problems of society, in order to transform society for the better, we need to talk to each other. We need conversations, because we can't understand each other or our problems without conversations. Conversations just like this. If you agree and want to be a part of what we do here at Novara Media, support our work. Go to novaramedia.com/support. Help us build a people-powered media for a rational, sensible, informed conversation about how we move together as a country. I'm not saying Jeremy Corbyn. What did Corbynism get wrong about class?
It almost goes back to this idea that if you think about the 30s or the 50s or whatever, this idea of the sepia-tinged photos of the working class. And it's interesting to go back to these historic writings on trade union and the labour movement, because obviously back in the day, the labour movement was led by the manual working class, and the struggle was always, how do we graft the white collar sort of middle classes, who are in a minority, by the way, how do we graft them onto our mass sort of working class movement? The difference now in the British class structure is that the middle classes, rather than falling away, as like Marx sort of suggested, are now enormous. The class structure, I had like a graphic, I don't know if I put it in the book, but it's like the class structure as it was in the 30s was, I think it was something like 5% of the population were managers and professionals. And then the overwhelming majority of people were sort of in blue collar proletarian manual jobs. And today it's totally the inverse. Managers and professionals are the single largest employment category if you look at the NCS class category, and the traditional working class is not as big as it was.
So managers, I think you put the number in there. It's something like 14% of the labour market, something like this.
Yeah, it's just
really big.
It's an enormous growth in managerial and professional work. Yeah, it's in a way that would have been seen as crazy, back in the day. But so in terms of the class character of Corbynism, I never wanted to like offend people or
we love that here on Novara Media. But be as offensive as you like. But
it goes back to what I said earlier. If you look at Jeffrey Evans and some of these political scientists, because I'm not particularly like a fan of political science, but some of the statistics are really, really interesting. And, and like it or not, low earners, in 2017 and 2019, were increasingly likely to leave Labour and start voting for the Conservative.
But they were more likely to vote for Labour.
No, low earners in 2019.
No, 2017. I think lower earners, because there was this whole debate, wasn't there? C2DE, so sociological sort of working class voters were going Tory. But then you looked at income stratification, which obviously maps again onto age.
Yeah.
And anyway, they were more likely to vote Conservative regardless than historically.
Yeah, so the theory is that class realignment was obviously, back in the day, low earners, the working class would vote for Labour, the middle class would vote for Conservatives. That is increasingly no longer the case. You have Thomas Piketty, the stuff on, the Brahmin left, this idea that the progressive forces are now being favoured by very well educated people who tend to, and this is the one that you pull the data apart. Not that I'm an expert on doing this, is that within that low earning cohort, a lot of them are sort of graduates. So that's some of the. But anyway, the point is that class realignment is sort of turned into permanent class de-alignment. In particular, 2019, a preponderance of low earners are now voting Conservative, which is really, really bad. And for all Corbyn's strengths, what I argued in the book is that I think the majority of his key social base, wasn't the working class. It was downwardly mobile graduates, and I, as I've argued in the book and as already intimated, I think that the desires of a lot of the people who were involved weren't actually. Was it really about a radical transformation of society, or was it about creating a more meritocratic society where actually we can take up our place in the class structure, our rightful place in the class structure, so I can have my lecturer position, so I can finally get a house. And I'm not saying these aren't absolutely laudable aims, which would have massively transformed society, but I don't think they were particularly radical in terms of like they're not revolutionary aims. It was about turning into a sort of.
But I don't think anybody would say Corbynism. I don't think any, because that might sound then like you're saying, oh, you think Corbynism's revolutionary? It wasn't. Yeah, I don't think many people think it was revolutionary, but I think you're right to say that the characteristics of Corbynism were far more socially liberal than economically socialist.
Yeah, and not Corbyn himself. I think and obviously I use the example of the EU. And again, I appreciate you guys are probably sick of talking about the EU and Brexit and things like that. But the pivot towards a second referendum was, as a lot of us, including yourself, argued at the time, was disastrous. But a lot of people in Corbynism not just went for it, and I don't really want to get sucked into a debate by the EU, but what I thought was interesting then was a lot of the people who were involved in it, that pivot towards a second referendum, in the same way as when I used to work in university and people in Portugal were voting leave and people were sort of horrified at that, they didn't really seem to understand why people didn't like the EU. So it seemed to me like they were, they had more in common, possibly culturally and ideologically, with the professional managerial classes. What's interesting in terms of the sort of overall picture of the class structure is there's an article by Guy Standing, who wrote The Precariat, and obviously everything he writes is really interesting. There's an article in 2020, just after the Labour loss, and he basically says that he calls for progressive forces to essentially write off the old working class and the petty bourgeoisie. He basically says that they're socially conservative, they're the new basis of the far right, which they are. Like as we'll get on to, the self-employed are massively overrepresented in UKIP, Brexit, and far right movements across the world. But he basically says, listen, we don't need this group of people. We need to focus on building a class coalition between the precariat, downwardly mobile graduates, and sort of progressive professionals. And I thought it was really interesting because he basically implies this hasn't happened. But when I looked at the Corbyn movement, and when I look at Podemos, when I look at Syriza, when we look at the Sanders campaign, that is actually exactly what's happened. These movements were sort of coalitions without the working class involved. I mean, that was obviously a bit of an exaggeration because Corbyn retained a quite strong minority of trade unionists and working class people that are always going to sort of vote Labour. But in terms of the new constituency, I did actually think that if you look at Corbynism objectively as a coalition, that's really what it was. It was about professionals. It's about the downwardly mobile graduates. And the problem is, across the world, we know now that coalition doesn't work. Podemos has failed. Syriza has sort of imploded. Corbynism has failed. But not just that, like the SNP is sort of, well, I don't know if they're imploding yet. The Welsh independence movement is sort of imploding. All these movements which don't actually take the old working class and the petty bourgeoisie with them, they don't hold. So I think that we've almost seen what happens when you don't get those people involved. The challenge, as we'll talk about, is how do we build a coalition when people think that there are obviously insurmountable sort of cultural and social rifts between certain groups.
Yeah, I'll bring in another anecdote, which of course we know. You're a sociologist. We know that anecdotes aren't particularly scientific, but
they're fun.
They are fun. I remember in May 2019, the European elections. Believe it or not, I was canvassing for Labour, even though I thought the position on the EU was just completely insane. And bark that. I'm sure many people watching this would disagree, but in 2016, 400 constituencies vote Leave. The minute you say they're all wrong, you cannot win an election. End of story. Anyway, I was canvassing for Labour, and I remember just walking along the street, and there was a guy in a wheelchair, like kind of rocker, long hair, interesting guy, older, maybe 60, 65. And I said, there's going to be elections soon, because obviously you had the May elections for the locals and the Europeans, and then you had a general election. He's like, what's that for? I'm saying it's the European election. But we've left. He was looking at me like I was from another planet. And I was like, but these European elections, and then, we might want to reform. I could have been speaking a completely different language. He said, but we voted to leave. We voted to leave. What are you talking about? And then I'd come to London, and there were people, or I go on Twitter, there's a majority for people, and I'm thinking, and by the way, that's never happened since. This divide in society being so obvious between, like I said, downwardly mobile, sort of graduate class, professional managerial class, professionals, and then like the rest of the country. It was so stark.
And that was one of the catalysts for writing the book. It was, obviously I'm from a low middle class background, and then when Brexit happened, I was in the university as a researcher, and I got increasingly uncomfortable about the way people who voted Leave were being spoken about. Some of the language was verging on like eugenics. Like these people shouldn't be allowed to vote. They shouldn't be allowed to have kids. All this stuff.
Really, from academics?
Well, people who were sort of progressive. See, people who consider themselves to be progressive. There was a lot of the sort of class hatred that I thought would always been like latent, really started to seep out. But obviously, it was always, the language was about education. People are uneducated. It's not that they're not there. You can't really, people wouldn't say scum or whatever, but it was fairly obvious what people were thinking, and I just
got a BA.
Yeah, but I started to get really, really uncomfortable with the way people were speaking about people who voted Leave, and then and as you said, ever since I've started to become aware, and we all know it, this increasing, I don't know what you'd call it, like an epistemic or gulf in understanding and life experiences between the Brahmin left, or Piketty says that the sort of progressive forces generally clustered in cities, and sort of everyone else. And that was the second referendum. Again, whatever you think of it, I thought was interesting because of the gulf in understanding. When I was saying you shouldn't overrule what people think, and it was like, well, I don't care what you think because they voted the wrong way.
Yeah.
And that was when I started to think, like, this is an enormous problem. This is an enormous realignment. I'm still very troubled by some of the language that's used, I think, by progressive people. I think it's like misanthropic. I think there's a view of the country as being sort of irredeemably racist and reactionary, or people are like fascistic. I really don't believe that. Like, I love people. I love Porthcawl. I love almost everyone you meet is a really nice person in my opinion. Like, and I wouldn't be a socialist. I don't know how you could be a socialist if you thought people were sort of bad, nasty, fascistic people. I really don't think that is the case. But anyway, that's possibly a digression. But the gulf is absolutely enormous.
And sticking with the Corbynism things, we're saying, what did Corbynism, not Corbyn, get wrong about class? For me personally, that whole thing around the second referendum really made me reconsider the idea of membership democracy, right? It really, because I've always said, and I still believe in open selections and primaries, of course, and I still believe in, member-led democracy, sort of membership-led rather parties, democratic parties. I certainly don't believe in the authoritarian top-down politics of someone like Keir Starmer. But you would see internal polling that says 70% of Labour members support a second referendum, and I'm like, they're wrong.
Yeah, that's the one.
They are objectors. I don't care if it's 99%. They're wrong. They will lose. And like you say, like, it really did make me reconsider that, because you can talk about membership democracy and 500,000 or 1 million members, but if they're only drawn from certain subsections of society, it doesn't matter, because they don't reflect the country. Ergo, they can't govern the country.
Yeah, and that's exactly the issue. Democracy, I think, is important, and membership democracy, again, not really into like the Labour Party, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It was obviously only going to show one way of thinking because the membership was drawn from a particular milieu, and if I just found it very frustrating. I still find it very frustrating when you're trying to talk to people about things like, particularly the Brexit vote. I never thought, because it was 2016, we're still all talking about it, but it was a really interesting moment, and for the professional managerial class, that was almost their first loss, their first L, and then they couldn't take it. It's the first time that things haven't gone their way, and obviously the response is just, well, we don't care, we'll just keep rerunning it until we get the result we want. But it's the misanthropy that came out, and this assumption of that people were reactionary and people were sort of irredeemably sort of nasty, that was one of the driving forces behind the book. I thought, well, I've got to sort of, I don't want to get sucked into like standpoint epistemology and like this is my lived experience and stuff, but I was like, generally people are generally quite nice. People are generally kind. People have very chaotic politics, no point denying that, but we live it. We can talk about this a bit later, but it's obvious people are going to have chaotic politics because we're in a class society, where it's been designed to create chaotic politics. But that's not to say people can't be won round. Well,
there's two aspects to that. The whole chaotic politics thing is just so true. Like you say, that's a feature of class-based societies. But then going back to that point of an era of progressive neoliberalism in decline or disintegration just makes it far worse. I talk about, I love this example. I love walking the dog, talking to people. There's a lovely guy I meet sometimes, talking to him when I walk the dog. I think he's probably historically a Tory voter. And he says to me one day, you know what, but he's like, you write books, don't you? I say, yeah, I've written a book, yeah. You know what book I really like? Oh, what's that? The Green Book by Gaddafi. And he's a Tory voter.
Yeah.
And like that complexity is so lost. And I think the left...
Great book.
This is very, very, certainly original. And I think the left, it's not to hit the left, because that nuance is completely skirted around in legacy media and Westminster political coverage.
Absolutely.
Political coverage in this country is not about the politics of the country.
No.
It's about the politics of 650 people in the House of Commons. And it's not complex and it's not nuanced. It's actually deeply uninteresting and quite boring and dull. That's why most people don't pay attention to it. The country is far more interesting. You made a point here about the misanthropy of the professional managerial class towards Leave voters. But it seems to go both ways. And this idea almost that the working class also hates the middle class. So here's another quote from page 284. See, when we do these downstreams, I do really, it's a 300-page book. We read them. It's not like Channel 4. As Mike Wayne puts it, quotes, among the huge barriers to be overcome in repairing the unravelling of solidarities is the deep class resentment and suspicion now emanating from the working class to the middle class left, whose priorities seem more and more remote every day from working class life worlds. Then you come back in. This is not hyperbole. Despite this, and despite claiming to have, quote, learned the lessons of 2019, it is clear that the new petty bourgeoisie, these downwardly mobile graduates generally, still do not really get the depth of the resentment that exists towards the Labour Party or the left more generally, or the ways in which the left excludes people. So how does the left exclude people?
Well, to go back to the gulf and the hatred people have, whether or not it's for the PMC or the professional managerial class, it all goes back to the Peter Mayer stuff, the rule in the void, this idea that politicians are no longer really that bothered about having any sort of constituency or a base or winning people over. They're just happy to just talk to each other, which is obviously you see as Keir Starmer personifies it. He's not pitching to any constituency. He's pitching to like Rupert Murdoch and possibly the security services. I don't know, but it's this idea. Maybe you said it. This idea of almost like when Greece was sort of defaulting or Italy was defaulting, the EU brings a technocrat in to sort of try to resolve the contradictions. That's almost what is happening with Starmer. Like just get someone in to manage the decline for a bit. The resentment that people have, not just for, like, I wouldn't say it's for the left, but for the Labour Party, certainly. I think a lot of people who sort of came into the Labour Party because of Corbyn, who were sort of inspired by Jeremy Corbyn, and rightly so, because he was inspiring. And I hope I'm not implying that it wasn't an important moment or people were wrong to support Corbyn, because they were right to support him. But the rot set in under New Labour and the professionalisation of the Labour Party, turning the Labour Party from a party of working class people into a party of sort of professional spads who openly sort of despised the working classes. The Peter Mandelson quote, we can do what we want because where are people going to go? They've got nowhere else to. They've got no one else to vote. And obviously, people did. People started voting for UKIP and Brexit and things like that. But Corbyn couldn't arrest those or reverse those that change. I mean, my dad's going to watch this, but my dad and a lot of other older Labour voters I know, people who are still furious at Tony Blair and what he did to sort of at the Labour Party. And obviously you've pointed out the sort of Blair's pernicious legacy, but I think a lot of people who are involved, if you're young and you're into politics, you don't maybe grasp the scale of the resentment. A lot of it, I say it's about the PMC, a lot of it is about the Labour Party, because the Labour Party have become the embodiment of that sort of professional class. And that is where almost not the sellout, but that's where a lot of the problems that the left faces are most apparent. You've got a former mass working class party that was taken over by sort of some of the worst people, I won't say ever, but some incredibly dislikable careerist politicians, and people just stop voting. One of the other biggest trends is that people stop voting. People stop participating in the democratic process, and totally justifiable. It's totally rational thing to do to not vote. Why would you vote? Because both parties are exactly the same. And I still think that a lot of the people who are sort of, if you're into politics, you're into left wing politics, you're almost, I'm not saying you're in the blob, but you're almost if you're into politics, you still think politics can sort of represent, can make a difference. Whereas a lot of other people have just said, I've had a guts full. I don't believe in any of this. And I think that the scale of that detachment and the scale of the anger out there hasn't really been appreciated, because, I'm upset about being downwardly socially mobile. It sucks, like not having to work in a bar and having to live in a rented accommodation, things like that. But, other people have been having really difficult situations for many, many years. It's not, it's not just us.
Many decades.
Well, yeah, decades. Yeah. It's not, and obviously you said like having 2 years or whatever renting is enough to radicalize. And someone said on Twitter, like, a graduate will have to pay rent for a year and then he becomes like a Maoist, because it's a radicalizing experience. But for a lot of people, that stuff has been going on for lives, for generations, and but a lot of people have also had the stuffing knocked out with them, to the point where politics is just, it's something that happens over there. It's something that happens and it doesn't affect our lives, or, I don't like any of them. And the problem at the moment, I think we've got as the left is sort of seen of somewhere in that blob. We're sort of a part of that political class because we're sort of involved in it.
For me, the saddest thing about Corbynism and Corbyn, the saddest thing is that a man who spent his life fighting against the elite within his own party, as much as the Tories, which is, people love to say, we voted against the Blair government so many times, voted against the Iraq war. Yes, he's probably a career politician because he's been in Parliament since, 1983, but he's been a campaigner in Parliament. I don't think it's fair to say he's a career politician like a lot of other people who we'd use those words for in British English. And yet he came to personify exactly the worst things that the working class, blue-collar workers, manual workers, old Labour voters, he came to personify all the things they hate about the professional managerial class, who he also has a critique of. And like, it goes back to the thing you said about Brexit. Corbyn's a Brexiteer. Like, he was most, and again, there's people watching this go, I like the EU, it doesn't matter. The point is, Corbyn, of all the politicians in the Labour Party, probably had the closest political position to historic blue-collar workers who vote Labour who don't do that anymore. You might think they're both wrong. Fine. I mean, I voted Remain. But it's ironic that he became, to be seen as the arch Remainer, isolated in his London bunker, surrounded by all his sort of millionaire acolytes. This is a guy who cycles to work, who has an allotment. He's a very simple man. And it's deeply depressing that he was allowed to be painted into that corner.
But the problem is the Labour Party. Because the Labour Party is a coalition, a class coalition between, many different classes, but the cadre or whatever that control the Labour Party is a professional managerial class. And as long as people like Corbyn and people on the left make this Faustian pact with those people under the name of unity, they're going to be tarred with the same brush. And one of the things I've started to think a bit more after I finished the book about how we build class coalitions and things like that. And I was thinking about the way that people not dismiss, but have this particular view of we can't go into how do we get the culturally conservative, let's say, I don't necessarily believe that's the case, but how do we get socially or culturally conservative working class people into a coalition with sort of progressive, downwardly mobile graduates, as if that's something that is insurmountable. But through the Labour Party, these sort of downwardly mobile graduates are already in a class coalition with the professional managerial class. I mean, you could call it a coalition, or in some ways it's probably a war, isn't it? There's a tension between the aims of and the policy wants of the downwardly mobile graduates who tend to be on the left, and then the sort of professionals who Starmer epitomizes. But nonetheless, from the outside, they're all sort of squabbling over the same party, and the left in particular always accommodate themselves to the needs and the whims of the professional managerial class that run the Labour Party. So is it really that impossible to believe that you could go into a coalition with another group of people if you've already made peace in some ways to get into coalition with people like Blair, people like Mandelson and things like that?
Yeah, it's so true. How can we have a coalition with people? And I actually think it's very possible, by the way. I do think it's very, I know we're going to talk about culture and identity politics and whatnot. I think you can absolutely build a coalition between the people we're talking about and more socially conservative voters who are left in the economy, because they do care about personal freedoms, they do care about civil liberties, but that's the frame you have to use. And I think the default attitude for most people, most of these voters is, you live your life, be happy, as long as you're leaving me alone. And to characterize that as sort of bigoted, small-minded, it's the opposite of small-minded, in fact. On this issue of the Labour Party and the kinds of coalitions that already exist, which we just take for granted, going back to the stuff around the second Brexit referendum, Lord Andrew Adonis was standing as a member of European Parliament for the Labour Party. This is the guy who basically came up with academies. And you have radical socialists campaigning for this guy to be in the legislature for a body which the British electorate doesn't want anymore. Like, it's so insane. And then people go, why does the working class hate us? Yeah,
and exactly. And that's what I always, I say to, I always talk about, we need to win, we need to win people over. And the fact that I maintain that a lot of the people who are deemed as deplorables, as Clinton called them, are not deplorable, and in fact can certainly be won over. But I'm always struck by this hypocrisy of like, well, those people are beyond the pale. But it's okay, as you said, it's also to end up campaigning for someone like Adonis, or end up campaigning for someone who in the Labour Party who could be like a war criminal or something like that. Do you know what I mean? So there's all these accommodations and coalitions going on with people like that anyway. So and in fact, a lot of the people who are deemed to be beyond the pale are a lot more progressive in their politics, and are a lot more radical than the professional managerial classes. And what I said in the book is that as long as you're hitching, whether it's through the Labour Party or not, as long as you're sort of in coalition with this group of people, you are never going to get any, we're never going to get like good things. We're never going to have radical, transformative, redistributive policies. And you're always going to get that legacy paternalism. I mean, you said this before, but I think it might be worth just beefing it up a bit. I mean, the professional managerial classes are almost like, I'm trying to think of it like yin and yang. You know, they're alongside the petty bourgeoisie. I'd say they're one of the main actors in politics at the moment. But the Ehrenreich's article on the rise of the professional managerial classes, and I know, by the way, a lot of people don't like the term professional managerial classes. I don't know why, because I think it's a really useful term. But at the core of the professional managerial class, you know, is this ideology of paternalism, this ideology that, you know, we need to help the poor, which is great, you know, like helping the poor. But the problem with that ideology is that it also contains an assumption that we need to help the poor because they are deficient in some way. So they need us, the sort of professionals, to come and sort their problems out for us. And that is at the core of like Fabianism. It always was. You know, when the Labour Party was coming together, the ILP and the Fabians, you know, the Fabians were like eugenicists. You know, they generally they did want to help the poor, but they also wanted to help the poor in this particularly paternalistic way. And one of the critiques of the welfare state, you know, back in the 70s or 80s by Stuart Hall and a bunch of other people, was that while people in the Labour Party love the welfare state and sort of fetishise the welfare state, actually the reason that Thatcher's criticisms of the welfare state took on is because a lot of people don't actually like being told what to do, being prodded and pushed around and told what's good for you by sort of experts. And I think that paternalism that underpins a lot of sort of modern labourism is really problematic. And I think when people talk about, like, you know, working class conservatives or working class authoritarianism, I think the bigger problem is that paternalism. What people are reacting against is basically being told what to do, being spoken to in a particular way, and squaring that circle is going to be quite hard.
It's a word we've used a lot already in this interview, but just to be clear, because again, it's the central look. The unstoppable rise of the petty bourgeoisie. Who are the petty bourgeois?
Oh yeah, I should have said that.
No. Because look, no, I think well, no, because everybody would have heard this term before. I remember once I said to my dad, he said he was working class or something, or maybe he said he was middle class, and I said, "No, you're petty bourgeois." And he was going to punch me because he's Iranian. He just heard the word petty. He's like, "Why are you fucking slagging me off?" No, it means little, small. Small bourgeois, because he's a taxi driver, he owns his own taxis. So I said, you have a relationship to the means of production, which is was being a little twat, 25-year-old graduate, you know, that's what I said to him. So what is the petty bourgeoisie? And particularly, can we talk about the two aspects of the petty bourgeoisie, which include both you and those guys who you would have grown up alongside in Porthcawl? Well,
as you said, the petty bourgeoisie, when we tend to use it on the left, is often seen as like an insult. If you read like Lenin and things like that, if you're petty bourgeois, it means you're individualist, or it just means a catch-all for anything you don't like. It's a pretty good way of doing it, because you can just say that's petty bourgeois, this is petty bourgeois. But a fairly niche concept traditionally in Marx is basically the middle classes. When Marx was writing during the sort of industrial revolution, this idea, the small artisan producer who owned his own workshop, you know, the small solo self-employed, I'm trying to think of an artisan profession, you know, like a carpenter or something like that. And Marx basically said that the petty bourgeoisie would disappear. It would fall away with the rise of oligarchic or monopoly capitalism. You know, the small producer would just become proletarianized and sink into the ranks of the proletariat. So what I argue in the book is that this didn't actually happen. The petty bourgeoisie, the small self-employed, always survived against the odds and are now pretty massive, well, a large chunk of the population, deliberately grown by Margaret Thatcher, who was, by the way, the personification of the petty bourgeoisie. You can talk about Thatcher a bit more later. I've sort of spent an unhealthy amount of time reading about Thatcher.
You read all the biographies, Charles Moore.
Yeah, no, I just skimmed the Charles Moore ones, but you know, reading a lot about her views on class are really, really interesting. But yeah, so the petty bourgeoisie is traditionally the small solo self-employed. So I'm arguing that rather than falling away, as Marx predicted, it has remained resilient and it's large. And I characterize the petty bourgeoisie in the modern era as being formed of two fractions. So it's a bit like a DNA double helix. And I've said this joke before, but I don't know anything about, you know, DNA or DNA double helix or anything like that. But I just saw something that has two parts. So I thought, so there's the old, which is the solo self-employed, and then there's the new petty bourgeois, which is this the mass now of sort of often downwardly mobile, but not always, often downwardly mobile, overeducated, white-collar graduates could be working in a call centre, could be working at the bottom end of the public sector, possibly like a teacher or a nurse.
Could be a Novara Media presenter.
Could be a Novara Media presenter, could be an academic, and so on and so forth. Maybe a lot of people who are watching Novara and listening to Novara would fall into this idea of the new petty bourgeois. So the new petty bourgeois is not, I mean, this isn't me being a coward and disavowing the concept, but it's not my concept. It's a concept that was first coined by Nikos Palansas in, I think, like 1975. And it was a new way of trying to categorize this explosion of unproductive white-collar work. And I'm arguing that both fractions of the petty bourgeoisie have grown enormously, and both of them play an enormous role in politics. You've got the solo self-employed are a key social base of the far right across Europe. The stalwart of the conservative vote ever since Thatcher. Boris sort of brought them back into the fold. But if you look at the stats of who votes for the Brexit Party, who votes for UKIP, who votes for Le Pen, who votes for trying to think AFD and things like that, the self-employed are disproportionately likely to vote for far-right parties, and a lot of the book is trying to explore why that might be. And then the new petty bourgeoisie of the downwardly mobile graduates tend to vote for the progressive parties.
So we say the sort of the cliche is politics is polarised, but actually it's the petty bourgeoisie which is polarised.
Yeah,
the new and the old.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it might see, I mean, I can't remember who said it because I've had a lot of sort of detractors, but people were saying, how can a new graduate, with progressive politics be in any way similar or any way part of the same class as a self-employed plumber or a carpenter or things like that? It sounds ridiculous. And on the face of it, the class is very different, because they're polarized politically. There's a lot of things they tend to not have in common. So, for example, the small self-employed tend to be geographically fixed because they've got a business, tend to not have gone to higher education, whereas the new petty bourgeoisie tend to be geographically mobile and tend to have gone through the higher education system and so on. But in some ways, and this is what Palansas would say, is that they share huge commonalities, even though they're polarized politically. The thing that split off the class is their different experience of social mobility. So the class, there's the working class that's sort of fixed, the bourgeoisie, which is sort of fixed, and then there's a petty bourgeoisie, which can move up or down. And the thing that has sort of made the old petty bourgeoisie tend to vote for conservative parties is that a lot of those people have achieved a degree of social mobility, or at least stability, through things like acquiring assets, like a house which has gone up in price, for example. And a lot of their politics are about or informed by, not what I'm going to win, but let's cling on to this, so I'm not going to fall down. So, whereas the new petty bourgeoisie have not actually had that social mobility. They're locked out of the housing market. We talked before about the death of the graduate premium. And so their politics are about actually, how can I reset this to get some social mobility? So both fractions of the class are into social mobility, are defined by their need for social mobility and defined by their precarity. And it's worth thinking about what the working class is, because traditionally the working class don't move up or down. Traditionally the working class are fixed and the petty bourgeoisie are not. And that's drive for social mobility which splits the class off from the working class. And obviously with the drive for social mobility comes things like individualism, status anxiety, the fear of falling down into the working class. And it's that fear of falling down into the working class which is such a huge motivator for people, because people often think that proletarianization or getting poorer is almost inexorably going to force people into sort of progressive political positions, that if enough people get poorer, then all of a sudden people will sort of rise up. Well, throughout history, the old petty bourgeoisie have gone to the right. They were the main social basis of fascism in Italy and in Germany, and the main social basis of Thatcherism. And a lot of the reason they go to the right is because of that status anxiety and panic of losing the sort of meager status over the working class. It was that sort of drove them into a frenzy. So yeah, I think that hopefully that sums it up. I don't know.
But it's important to say that the petty bourgeoisie haven't just been the bulwark of fascism, which is undeniable, or quite reactionary politics. They've also been involved in revolutions. The petty bourgeoisie play a very central role in 1848. They play a very central role in the 1830 revolution. There's that amazing picture by Eugène Delacroix, Liberty leading the people. People might think, what the hell is he talking about? I'm not an art historian. It is Liberty, a woman holding the French tricolor, and beside her are three figures. One is a young urban worker, one is a student, and one is like the middle class. So you have like this interesting, the classical working class, the petty bourgeoisie, and like the graduate without a future, the exact coalition you're talking about. Yeah. So, and that they oversee a revolution in 1838. They're also, like I say, quite significantly there in 1848. And arguably in Paris, they play something of a role in the Paris Commune in the 1870s, but we can park that. They haven't always been right-wing, is the point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a tough sell to tell people this class can be won over for the left, because they were the main social base of fascism, main social base of Nazism. But when I did the history chapter, I wanted the history chapter to be a bit of a revisionist history, because I think if you're a Marxist, if you're on the left, we have a vision of history which is sort of quite neatly divided into, there's the historic proletariat and, driving history forward in battle against the bourgeoisie. But actually, if you look at what's happened, is the petty bourgeoisie, one, have always been very big, or at least a significant social force. Hate them or love them, they've always been there. So it's to take them seriously as a significant political actor. The early Owenite socialists that Marx and Engels looked to, they were all artisans. There was I read a bit Mike Davis book after I wrote that. I should have read it before, but he sort of characterizes the early anarchist movement, the Narodniks and things like that, and all the people who were throwing bombs into the theatre and things like that to sort of kill the royals. He characterizes anarchism as a petty bourgeois movement. He said this is the artisans at the time were getting frustrated politically at they thought the working class would have caught up politically and things like that. So the anarchists were almost all small self-employed men, and they took it upon themselves to sort of act, again, we could argue individualistically, but they took it upon themselves to act in that way. But yeah, third world anti-colonial movements, if you read like Aimé Césaire, things like that, Cabral, is that it was the local petty bourgeoisie that actually led the revolutions, because there wasn't an industrial proletariat in a lot of these sort of countries. So it has often played a radical role. And I never used to read Trotsky, for various reasons, but I sort of really got into Trotsky right in the book, because he was obviously one of the few Marxists that sort of chronicled the rise of fascism. And he sort of says very, very clearly the petty bourgeoisie can 100% be won over to the left. They just need a strong working class movement to win them over. And it's quite prescient what Trotsky says. He says that the problem is, he says, the petty bourgeoisie, they look at the left and they see only parliamentarism. They see only moderation. And he basically says they don't trust the left to overthrow the system and attack big monopoly capital. And obviously fascism has the rhetoric, incredibly radical rhetoric. Obviously, once in power, then fascism strangles the petty bourgeoisie, and it doesn't change the system. It's corporatist. But he says they're attracted to fascism precisely because of the radical anti-monopoly language that the fascists would use. But he's very clear. Very clear. He says that what we need to be aiming for is a coalition between the petty bourgeoisie, the immiserated, destroyed small businessman, and the working class. And Lenin says it clearly as well. They spent a lot of time. It's obviously not so much in Marx, but these socialists who are concerned with strategy and revolutionary moments say that you've got this bulk of people, the petty bourgeoisie, they're not going away. We have to win them over. There's no alternative. You can either win them over and have them on your side, or you can have them go over to the right and be sort of used by the state to crush the working class movement, which is what happened. And I think if you look at what's happening at the moment across Europe, so we've had a strike wave, which is absolutely fantastic. The left are mobilizing, or Mick Lynch says the working class are back. And across the world, there is a strike wave, and it is really encouraging. But the petty bourgeoisie are on the march as well. There's the far right. They've got farmers' protests across Europe. Literally almost the dictionary definition of the old petty bourgeoisie. The small farmers not marching. They're driving their tractors into the town squares across France and Netherlands and sort of spraying manure on things. And it's quite interesting because Trotsky and Lenin and Gramsci saw the petty bourgeoisie as extremely dangerous. They were scared of them as a class because they said they didn't have that sort of discipline of the working class movement because they lived individualized lives. So they had the same anger, exactly the same anger as the working class. And in many ways they say, and it's definitely the case now, in many ways their lives were a lot harder than the working class because they were totally immiserated, totally isolated. And he just basically said this anger, furious anger doesn't get socialized. So Marx talks about the collective worker and this idea that the worker in the factory will inevitably begin to sort of start thinking collectively, that he's got stuff in common with his fellow workers against the bosses. Well, the petty bourgeoisie have that sort of core anger, but it doesn't get socialized into a collective, and that makes it extremely dangerous. And politically, the forms of protest that the petty bourgeoisie tended to take part in were not like disciplined strikes or things like that. They were spontaneous street violence, smashing the place up. And you're sort of seeing it happen across Europe at the moment. And we're coming to a situation, very, as you said, the death of progressive neoliberalism, which is very, very similar to what was happening in the 30s. I mean, the only difference really is that there is no working class, not much of a working class movement to crush anymore.
Or an organised fascist movement of people who fought in a world war 15 years earlier, unfortunately.
Yeah, but that's not there as well. But there are obvious parallels in terms of the petty bourgeoisie are on the march. And the issue is like, well, what do you do with these people? Do you bring them over into your coalition or do you ignore them? And there's clearly massive unease about petty bourgeois demonstrations like the truckers' protests in the UK. People sort of looked at this and the truckers movement in Canada. And I think the left looked at them and were like, these guys are nuts. They're scary people. And what's happening across Europe is the far right is on the march in rural areas, and it's taken off in rural areas because the left isn't really dealing with some of the things that the farmers are saying. And again, you see one of the problems is that the farmers will perceive the left as being part of the sort of coalition that is telling them, actually small farmers are going to have to bear the brunt of getting down to net zero, things like that. And we can talk about this a bit later if we've got time. But one of the interesting thing about what's happening in France at the moment is that, we always look at France in the UK and think, why can't we be like that? Why can't we riot? Or why can't we protest like the French do? Why can't we stand up for ourselves like the French do? For me, the interesting thing about what's happening in France is that you are seeing the basis of a sort of cross-class coalition between the yellow vests and the sort of French workers' movement. So Ollie Haynes has written all this stuff about sort of France and the French protests. And he actually says there's a thing called the Gilets jaunification of the French left. Because when the Gilets jaunes came out, it was like the personification of the petty bourgeoisie, just totally chaotic politics. So these people came out and, one, they were in rural areas. Two, they were saying things like we're anti-tax. We're also anti-immigration. Some very, very reactionary opinions, but also some very potentially radical opinions. And at the time, I think it's 2018, they sort of emerged. The French left were like, who are these guys? Scary people, didn't know what to do with them. But now there's sort of been an alliance, and not a formal alliance, but a de facto alliance between these sort of groups, realizing that actually, obviously, the things that are immiserating the lower middle classes and the small farmers are the things that are immiserating everyone. And there's been a real attempt to come together. And what you're seeing as a consequence is the protests are spread in France against the pension age rise. We're spreading out for the first time from the cities to the rural areas, and that's got to happen. I mean, me and you talked about this on Twitter, but when the anti-immigration protests in Knowsley, outside Liverpool, another small town that's being targeted by the far right, and then lo and behold, there's a protest against. And I think they tried to set the immigration centre on fire in South Wales at the moment. There've been asylum seekers have been resettled in a hotel in Llanelli, and lo and behold, the far right mobilizing, and the left have this sort of thing. It was like, why doesn't someone organize people in Knowsley? Why don't we organize in Knowsley? And I was like, well, you've got to live there first. You've got to live and work there. But instead, we're all living in cities, and it's the same. The far right patriotic alternative are flyer in small towns across the UK. They're flyer in Porthcawl. They're flyer in Llanelli. They're flyer in Llantwit Major around Cardiff. They're sort of leaving the cities, but they're really putting the work in these sort of small towns. And the problem is that now all the young people, the young progressive people, have just left on their social mobility journey. Well, it's almost an open goal for the right. We have to find a way of squaring that circle.
You mentioned Thatcher and how she's the sort of quintessence of petty bourgeois politics in this country. The grocer's daughter. She's an amazing politician. Even Keir Starmer was like, I have a profound respect for free enterprise, blah, blah. Everybody has to say this after Thatcher. Everybody. Before Thatcher, it's just a weird thing to say. Harold Wilson would say, I'm a technocrat. I want to help create the conditions for business and workers to thrive. But he wouldn't talk in those terms. But Thatcher is like the political id of the petty bourgeoisie.
Yeah, that's a great way of describing it.
She is, right?
Yeah, of course.
And we're still living in that shadow that to be a successful politician in this country, to be a really successful populist politician, you have to embody that. And there's been nobody like her on the right, with the exception of Farage and Johnson.
Yeah.
And again, it's in London, Farage is very Marmite. Lots of people hate him, but some people do also really like him. And it's exactly the people you're talking about outside of major cities, petty bourgeois, smaller business owners. Farage was saying, cut VAT, do this, do that, bloody London, bloody, for instance, I'll give you an example. In Dorset, Dorchester is where you have like the local county council, and all the farmers in West Dorset, they talk about Dorchester like it's Stalin's Moscow. Like there's the Treblinka there and the Red Square. They view Dorchester, this little Mickey Mouse Dorset town, as like bureaucracy and the state, and they're just pushing us down. They're taking our money. They're taxing us. And Farage just gives vent to all of it. And, and again, I'm not saying Farage is something, he's lost 7 or 8 elections. I'm not suggesting he's never got the critical mass in a particular constituency, but it's speaking to 20-25% of the country who actually do matter. Like if you want to get a social majority, of course that matters. And only the Conservatives think about that question in those terms. And it's Thatcher who really redefined that political geography, isn't it?
100%. So, as you said, Thatcherism just personified the petty bourgeoisie. She was the daughter of a greengrocer. When she came to power, she started all her maiden speeches are about being the daughter of a greengrocer, and she started, the narrative of the British economy being tied to analogous to a household budget. She used this idea of this concept of thrift. That was all rooted in this idea of the small business. We have to balance the books and things like that. And so much of her ideology, because we talk about neoliberalism sometimes as if it's sort of some nebulous, just some vague thing that we've all internalized. And in some ways it is. But what I've argued in the book is that Thatcherism, the British variant of neoliberalism, you cannot understand the society we live in and Thatcherism without understanding the petty bourgeoisie. So not only was Thatcher herself, the personification of the petty bourgeoisie, all the policies she wanted, she wanted to restore. She wanted to change the class structure. She wanted to get rid of the industrial working class. And the thing is, she did actually hate the working class, which was she was the traditional petty bourgeois uptight view of the working class as sort of being lazy or scary or bolshy and things like that. And she generally did.
Violent.
Yeah, and she generally did despise the industrial working class, and she wanted to bring. She also, by the way, despised the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, and there's all these things in her autobiographies about how she absolutely reveled in firing sort of old patrician conservatives. But she obviously revolutionized the Tory party in terms of the ideology. The sort of patrician One Nation Tory sort of was torn up, and it was replaced by the values of the petty bourgeoisie. Including get rich quick, although that's arguably sort of a vulgar manifestation of it, because they said that she wanted to create the society of her dad, but she ended up creating the society for her son, who was just like a spiv. But she deliberately fostered, she deliberately increased the amount of people who were self-employed, for one. So on a very simple, like literal basis, she actually did grow this class. She grew her own base. She obviously, I think it was like 1 million self-employed people when she took office in 79, and by the time she finished, it was 4. I think it's or 3. The stats are all in the book, but deliberately tried to build her base. Things like the right to buy, obviously a sort of a masterstroke that we're still living with the after effects of right to buy. But it was all about changing the class structure back to this idea of chocolate box houses, a nation of shopkeepers. And it was a project of restoration. But what I've sort of said in the book, as well as actually growing the petty bourgeoisie, is that, and they are now big, is that the society we live in, we all now sort of, we all sort of live under the same, and we all occupy the same sort of conditions of employment that the petty bourgeoisie used to. So even if you're not, for example, formally self-employed, we all have to take on the sort of self-employed mentality. We're all sort of in LinkedIn. If you're a junior academic, for example, you're thinking of yourself de facto as a self-employed person. You're thinking about your own way up the sort of career structure. You're not thinking of yourself in terms of a collective. People want to get on the housing ladder. People work in more isolated conditions. We work in a non-unionized. We're living in the society that she wanted to create, really, and obviously she wanted to rebuild the society in the image of the petty bourgeoisie. It's really, you cannot understand modern society unless you understand the petty bourgeoisie. Hence I wrote a book. Hence wrote a
300-page book about it. But it is, you say housing. I think most people would say, yeah, I get it. She built the long-term, she dismantled the working class base.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Social democracy. And she built her own long-term base through housing and right to buy. But it's also through education, the 1988 Education Act, and making education a competitive endeavor.
Absolutely.
And transforming fundamentally what education was for and what its purpose was. And I suppose, we've talked about this many times, like a transformational project on the left has to do something quite similar. And Grace Blakely says, Thatcher takes on organised labour. I would add she takes on football hooligans. She takes on forms of collectivity, which are very anathema to petty bourgeois culture. She smashes them. And the left would clearly have to do something quite similar. So it would clearly have to enact policies like right to buy, like the Education Act, which would build its base, but also it would need to identify class enemies, just as she did, and generate really a national political message in response to that.
Well, she, if I can just jump in there, I'm sorry, but she really did understand class, I'd say, a lot better than almost all Labour politicians ever.
Most Marxists these days.
Yeah, she understood, as you said, how to build a hegemonic project, how to build a class coalition, how to hone in on a section of the population and give them things. And she did. People got their council house. You can still meet dyed-in-the-wool Thatcherites now. A lot of it is just rooted in, I bought my own house, under Thatcher. I've now got wealth. And in terms of the enemy, her enemy was interesting because it was the working class. That's when the narrative of the shirkers and scroungers sort of comes in. There was the strivers versus the skivers and so on and so forth. So it's attacking the people below, but she really did go for the sort of the state and the bureaucrats, the professional managerial class, and that really appealed to the low middle classes. And as you said, nothing has happened. Well, you could argue Blair, Blair at least had a base in the professional managerial class, but
there's a little bit of a realignment. I mean, that's after 2010, that sort of disappears, right?
Yeah,
the easy formulation is Thatcher's people are petty bourgeoisie, Blair's are the professional managerial class.
Yeah, of course, yeah, that's a good shorthand.
And between them, you have a sort of post-democratic arrangement which locks out, the sort of bottom sort of 50% of society. Yeah. What do you think of Just Stop Oil? So we've talked about forms of working class solidarity, etc. We've talked about where the new left comes from. Is Just Stop Oil a reflection of the composition of this new left? Those kinds of tactics, for instance.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I think Matt Huber in his book Climate Change and Class War, and some of the things people say, there is an intimation that the environmental movement is sort of reflective of a particular milieu, you know, the student politics, professional managerial class. So I'm torn with Just Stop Oil, because on the one hand, I absolutely support everything they're doing, and should be a basic thing on the left to support all direct action. It's horrific, like them getting like attacked and so on and so forth. So I support their aims. I support the concept of direct action. On the other hand, as someone who has grown up around, you know, white van man, or sort of, I'm trying to think of that guy's name. What's his name? You know, Tom Skinner. Then there is something about
the Dino.
Yeah, Dino. Yeah, as someone who has grown up around Dino and I'd love to be Dino. You know, it's not like I'm trying to see the whole point of everything is build a coalition. The whole point of everything is to how do we get working people, whether they're the white van man or traditional working class people, into a big enough coalition that we actually do something about this. And it's a problem of all activism, is that it does reflect a particular habitus and a particular way of doing politics, which people obviously don't get if you're in that world, and if you have that particular habitus, then you don't understand how those things are sort of and when I say off-putting, I don't want to get sucked into, you know, authentocracy and, you know, make it weird or say that they're all middle class people, or that, because they're very brave people, and I think what they're doing is really important and interesting. But Huber talks about it, and then I talked about it briefly with the farmers. If we're gonna do anything about it, we do have to build a coalition. And one of the interesting things I think about the getting to net zero and some of the things that the EU have brought in with emissions and things for farmers is that the burden of all these, it's the small businessman or the small producer that is going to bear the brunt of a lot of these things, while big businesses are allowed to sort of get around it through things like carbon capture and all those sort of loopholes. So I can understand why people getting to work do get angry with Just Stop Oil. And I know on the one hand, people will say that that's the whole point of direct action, is to be disruptive. I can equally see why people are in a rush. You know, people are in a rush. People don't want to lose their job. If people are being made late for a job, that stuff is, you can see why people get angry. So I don't necessarily know what the answer is for all of that, but we of course have to be aware on the left of how other people perceive different forms of action. And I think you know, it would be good to tell Just Stop Oil, well, listen, you should only focus on hurting big businesses, and then they would say, well, we do that as well. And then they do that, but it doesn't get the same form of publicity. Just
throw confetti at George Osborne.
Yeah.
Just the record, while we're talking about Just Stop Oil, I don't want people to think when I'm saying, you know, are their tactics right, wrong? That was brilliant. I'm not one of these people. I mean, we did a Novara Live at the time. People go, oh, confetti, that ruined his wedding. If that ruined his wedding, then I feel very sorry for his wife and their marriage. Anyway, but it's a really important thing, which is, look, climate change is one of the big issues of our time, up there with inequality, you know, spiraling inequality, which can have massive political fallouts. And the question is, how do you convince a social majority to do something about it? So it's not to attack Just Stop Oil,
no,
and it's not to say that we've got the answers.
Yes.
But I think there is absolutely a place for direct action. I think what they do is brilliant. It keeps them permanently in the media cycle. My worry is, and this isn't on them, in the absence of a mass movement making these arguments in towns and villages which aren't major cities, I suspect it's not going to work. I think it may even backfire. That's not their fault.
No, exactly.
That's our fault. That's the left's fault, collectively. But I do worry, without that bolted on, and without that appreciation of the kinds of class we need to actually win over to these things, might end up being a little bit counterproductive.
Yeah, and the worry for me with all of it, as you said, I'm not going to criticise like Just Stop Oil or any of the people who've done the campaign, because it's very brave and it's very extremely laudable. But there is a worry with all this that it does backfire. The bigger worry for me is the fact that as a left, insofar as a left still exists, you know, as a left, are we, by saying we have to, you know, got to get to net zero, we have to get rid of cars, we have got to get all this stuff, you end up being perceived as just being part of the state and an elite which is telling people what you can and can't do. And what is happening is that, for me, often it's no different from, the drink, you getting rid of disposable straws, in that it's passing the burden of these problems down to people who are not the problem. It's the military industrial complex. It's like, it's all these things which are, it's not a bloke driving a van to work, or it's not a small farmer. It's things that are a lot bigger than most people. And if we as a left are sort of getting sucked into this nanny state sort of thing of like, actually you can't, the protests in Oxford about 15-minute cities and stuff, but massively taxing motorists, things like that. It's just gonna deepen this perception that the left is just part of the state, part of an elite, part of professional managerial class telling everyone what to do. And like Porthcawl doesn't have a train station. Porthcawl doesn't have a train station. Large swathes of the UK don't have train stations. They have terrible public transport. Like you cannot survive unless you have a car. And all these, we just have to think about how these things are being perceived and how we are coming off, and start to think about building a majority. And the way to build a majority is not to scold people who necessarily drive cars or who have to. Not everyone can cycle to work and things like that. And I do worry, the same as you, that often this could be even counterproductive, and that's the last thing we want, is the people to have, there's a backlash against it. I mean,
imagine if it's the January of 2024, inflation's, it's going down at the moment. Let's say it's still quite high. There are strikes, so you can't, this is your sort of, you're under pressure consultant. You've just renewed your mortgage. You're coming in from God knows where, Sussex or Surrey, going into London, quite affluent, but downwardly mobile. You just bought a 2-bed flat somewhere. Mortgage is astronomically expensive. There's the rail strike, you can't get in. You're driving in, the road is shut, the motorway is shut because of Just Stop Oil activists. It's almost like a Michael Douglas falling down moment. Yeah. And I can understand how that creates just incredible anger. The world is against it.
Absolutely.
And the left can't be part of that world. We have to be part of the solution. And again, that's not to ostracize the Just Stop Oil. I'd say the action on a motorway would be bad, but I think in the absence of that broader movement, sort of explaining why we need to decarbonize, But can I just ask as well, where does this come from? So I'll give you another example. Now, this may be very controversial. Jordan Henderson's gone to Saudi Arabia. He's gone to play for in Saudi Arabia, club football.
Big great loss.
Look, I know some Liverpool fans, he should not have been anywhere near the England squad for the last 2 years. But anyway, he's been awful. And I was saying this in the Euros. He's fantastic. He's a leader. We just go.
This is the most controversial thing you've said in a while, I think.
Yeah, he's shouting at people, and that's why Jack Grealish and Phil Foden can't make the first 11. Okay, I mean, I can shout at people. I've got 2 left feet. He's gone to go play in Saudi Arabia, earning huge money, and people are rightly saying, Jordan Henderson, I thought you were an LGBTQ ally. Yeah. Rightly. I agree with that. And I want to be clear about that. But it is strange that there's more anger for Jordan Henderson going to play club football in Saudi Arabia than the fact that this country's government sells tens of billions of pounds of weapons to the Saudi Royal Air Force to kill Yemenis. It doesn't make it... How do we not generally care about this stuff as a culture? And then, there's a footballer who's going to play for Al Hilal or wherever the hell he's going to go. Everybody's up in arms. Where does this culture come from? Because it seems quite new.
What, the individualising of problems? I don't know, but you're absolutely right in terms of the way we view. I mean, we could be here all day talking about how people behave on social media and things like that, but it's almost like there's a culture now of people can't distinguish between individuals, like small movements, and like brands and things like that. And I think this sort of American liberalism form of sort of online activism, which is basically just trying to get people to apologize or holding individuals accountable, and you hold states accountable or things like that. It's just seeped into how we view the world. And so an individual is seen as bad as a state, or rather the stuff is ignored. But that's terrible. Because we become used to sort of gesture politics
and that's all we can expect, actually. That's the best we can do is an apology from Jordan Henderson. We definitely can't change UK foreign policy.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, and I think a lot of this stuff, the sort of individualization and the hyper sort of policing of everyone, not just celebrities, but policing ourselves online on Twitter and sort of attacking each other. All that for me comes from a place of weakness. It's that is social pessimism. Nothing else can change. So for the moment, let's just retreat into a subculture and sort of and scold each other. And that has become what praxis is. But no, it's nonsensical.
I'm going to finish on this because you've said that, and it leads us on perfectly to my final quote from your book, page 301, Dan. Now, I read this
to Aaron.
Yeah. I have to say, a lot of this critique, I think, maybe when Dan was writing this, was he thinking about Novara Media?
No.
Leftist media figures? Oh, okay.
No, I thought I was thinking about very specific managers a lot of the time.
No, I'm joking. Here we go. Quote, there is a pessimism on much of the left that I cannot understand or comprehend. If I thought people were bad or selfish, I could not get out of bed in the morning, let alone be a socialist. It is a cruel irony that the more time one spends in leftist activism, the more depressed and helpless one will get. It is only when one spends time outside the moralizing and careerism of leftist circles, wow, among normal, decent, often apolitical people, that one feels optimistic about human nature again. That's a pretty extraordinary paragraph.
Might have gone a bit, a bit hard there.
Because the whole book is very sort of calm, measured, sociological, and then this is just really...
Yeah, lost it. Just Michael Douglas moment.
Do you think your Michael Douglas moment, do you think there is too much pessimism on the left?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite weird, actually, because I've sort of had two recent periods. The first one... in academia, online all the time, obsessed with Twitter, almost get socialized into this sort of hysterical, it's just mass hysteria about everything, everyone's terrible. And then sort of burnt out, did a lot of like activism and then I've had a break from academia for nearly 5 years where I've obviously worked with the homeless, prison leavers.
Specifically, what were you doing?
So I was a rough sleeper worker, so an outreach worker in Cardiff. Not really involved in activism, but just throwing myself into working with mainly recent prison leavers, people with very, very chaotic politics, by the way. And obviously in this role, to be effective in any way, you can't have any sanctimony, you can't have any judgment about people, you have to be empathetic. And I think it sort of changed, it's like it switched my brain, or it flicked a switch, and it was like, well, even though you're actually seeing people at the absolute lowest point, you saw some really terrible, depressing things, but it's so much humanity, so many people working in the field who are like, doing great things, people who aren't really into politics, people who might not necessarily have good politics. A lot of the lads I was working with, as in the rough sleepers, had deeply chaotic politics, because they're at the absolute lowest end. There's a lot of sort of racial resentment, a lot of ethnic tensions at that sort of lower end. People are moaning about certain groups, people moaning about Ukrainians having hotels or jumping the queue and things like that. So in some ways it was an extremely depressing period of my life. But on the other hand, it was like, because you cannot be sanctimonious, because you have to sort of see the good in people, because you have to help people regardless of their past. And more importantly, you have to win people. It just made me realize that with all this stuff, you just have to win. You just have to win people over, and that most people are actually good. I really do, hand on heart, believe that. I just started to think, well, this is the other thing. Most people, especially working class people, and a lot of the homeless lads, have incredibly strong, like incredibly powerful class consciousness and an innate understanding of what's going on in the world. Like, not necessarily always it works out in a coherent, sophisticated, like perfect socialist analysis, but a basic understanding that there are powerful people that are sort of oppressing the working class, and that working people have more in common with each other than they do with the sort of the bosses. And a lot of time that stuff gets sucked into sort of conspiracy theory or other things. But there's the core is unarguable. The problem is that there's no trade unions. The left is sort of weak, so we're not grabbing people who've got that anger and saying, look, this is the way. So I've I'm not saying, is it red pill to use these days, or black pilled, whatever? But
you're not black pilled.
No, whatever. I'm pilled on winning people over and like being nice to each other and being sort of gentle and kind being kind online and things like that. And then I've had this one world where people are sort of really low and everyone's helping each other out and showing extreme solidarity and comradeship to each other in a sort of apolitical setting. And then you come back into, you log onto Twitter and you just see everyone's fascist, this person must condemn this because he liked a tweet that so-and-so, and a real pessimism about human nature, but also like a pessimism about building coalitions. And I have to admit, 10 years ago, I probably would have been the same. Probably would have been the same. Like, I'm not going to speak to that person because they disagree with me on like Welsh independence or something like that. But now it's like the more time you spend offline, the more time you spend in, I guess with normal people or apolitical people. I started to feel really optimistic about the world again. There's one more thing. I've got an anecdote about why I was so angry when I was writing that. So I was a trade union rep in my old job, and you're representing people who are being spoken to like dirt by management, and obviously if you were representing them in a disciplinary or whatever, you'd be also spoken to like dirt. And I had one, and again, it's an anecdote, but one day where I had sort of been representing this lad, and I was just rattled by how I was being spoken to by the management, and then I remember going to a political meeting, like a leftist political meeting in the evening, and just being spoken to in exactly the same way, like exactly the same tone by my comrades, this sort of patronizing, being spoken down to, sort of scolding, like basically don't have a laugh, don't have fun, don't say this or whatever. And I just remember thinking, this is... And then that's when I started to think, well, a lot of this is about the professional milieu that a lot of these people come from, because they tell people a lot of the people who are involved in a lot of these groups do tell people what to do for a living.
But it's not just their habitus from work and their jobs. It's the habitus also from their parents.
Of course.
This is the amazing... And again, I never thought about this. My mum was... I say I'm middle class. I say I like M&S Gold tea.
Is it nice?
Oh, it's fantastic. I love Waitrose. Okay, but my mum was a cleaning lady. She became a social worker, and my dad's a taxi driver. Growing up, I didn't have people like telling me what to do. It was very much the default was live and let live. Okay, I don't have the mental or emotional bandwidth to worry about what this person thinks. But then you realise that not everybody is raised in those situations. People whose parents are managers who tell people what to do for a living raise their children in a commensurate fashion. They are constantly giving out commands. And that socializes like the younger milieus that come into what's called, quote unquote, the new left. Not everyone. Again, I don't want people to get angry at me, but there's clearly...
They will anyway.
No, they will. But there's clearly like a cultural disconnect between people socialized in one way and people socialized in another. And that's kind of congruent with what you're saying, which is people were speaking to you in a way which was like a manager.
Well, there's Barbara and John Ehrenreich write the articles on the professional managerial classes in the 70s. She then has an interview, can't remember who it was with, but she basically says, she reflects on a life of organising, and she said the biggest problem, the biggest tension was trying to bring together people who told others what to do for a living and people who took orders for a living. And it says some really interesting anecdotes that she uses about she's mortified. She brings together these sort of like tries to bring together sort of working class autodidacts from like the factories and things with sort of college professors. Immediately, the college professor starts sort of speaking down to the sort of blue collar workers. And the thing is, as you said, people don't even know they're doing it because they're socialized in a different way. Because class is about your habitus is the product of history. It's like Mike Savage says in the Great British Class Survey, it's accumulated history. It's these things come through generations, and it becomes normalized, the way of thinking, the way of speaking, the way of talking to others, and it does. And some people clearly don't know they're doing it, but and equally, I think a lot of the way we talk about class in the UK, we often swear off culture. We say, well, class isn't about culture, it's not about consumption habits, it's not about whether you eat avocado and things like that, because that's what the British media use when they talk about class, and that's what the concept of authentocracy is all about. This people using cultural signifiers to prove they're working class. And I think it's right. It was right to sort of kick off about those things and to say, well, you know, class isn't just about consumption. But when you say class is about culture, or Bourgeoisie is like class is about habitus, it's not about that. When he says class is cultural in the sort of Raymond Williams sense of culture is ordinary, in terms of the institutions we hang out in, the spaces we go to, the way you speak to people, the way you think, your accent, the way you talk to people, even the way you stand. All these things, he says, are sort of inscribed in the body in ways that are so central to sort of everyday human interaction. And the problem is, I think, is this, we talk about this, like this gulf in understanding, is that if you've never really felt out of place in sort of an elite institution, or if you've ever felt out in place in, let's say, the left or whatever, then it's very hard to understand why someone would feel out of place. But it's a very jarring experience. And there's all these books, there's a whole massive body of work of people who feel out of place, you know, Good Will Hunting, people who experience limited social mobility and are immediately like, oh, this is awful. And that's about, you know, when the habitus clashes with the field, you know, you feel like a fish out of water. And it's very difficult to understand. Is in the Great British Class Survey, you know, the book, sorry, Mike Savage, you know, they say about it's this thing of being able to negotiate with institutions, being able to deal with institutions, being able to speak to your manager, or being able to talk to your manager without being, you know, sort of terrified. And I've had all these things when I entered academia. I didn't really write that much about this in the book, but you know, when I went to academia for the first time, it's absolutely overwhelming. You just feel absolutely terrified about you know, speaking to your professor. The way you felt like I was getting spoken to just felt like I was being sort of insulted, but in a very subtle way with a sort of a veneer of politeness, you know. And obviously there are a lot of academics who've had the same experience. But that stuff is important. That stuff is really important for understanding. That stuff is really important about building coalitions. If you don't appreciate the different ways in which other people see the world and other ways people act, then it's very hard to see how we can build coalitions.
Sticking with the professional managerial class and like the people who tell other people what to do for a living. And by the way, I'm terrified I will become this person, because obviously I have opinions for a living. At Novara Media, we have a 1-to-1 pay ratio and whatnot, but there are certain managerial functions. I don't line manage anyone. I am line managed, but you know, I participate in certain executive functions within the organization. And I think, well, this is how I will talk to my child, you know, my daughter or son, and then they will be these people that, you know, in the left in 25 years time will be, you know, the Dan Evans of the 2050s will be, you know, decrying Aaron Bastani's child. So I you know, I'm not there, but for the grace of God go I. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But do you think that the professional managerial class have changed nature in recent decades, where I genuinely believe they increasingly don't believe or subscribe to equality under the law, fairness? This is mind-blowing, because I always thought in this country, I don't believe in this idea of British common sense, blah, blah, blah. I think most people are fair, regardless of where they come from. I always thought the professional class believed in basic fairness, equality under the law, due process. I wouldn't want something done to you because I wouldn't want it being done to me, like a quite basic calculation. Yeah. And actually, I don't think they believe in that stuff anymore. And maybe they never did, but I can only talk about my own sort of timeline, my own life. And it does strike me as, I don't think they believe in democracy anymore.
No.
They do not believe in democracy. Like this idea of the very notion of Labour as a membership party and ordinary people having scrutiny over MPs and shaping policy, they despise it, they loathe it, they find it vulgar. But also, look at the Farage debanking story, right? 60%, by the way, I think 60% of the public, you know, think this is really bad. We now know this is confirmed. So Farage had a bank account with Coutts, for people who aren't aware, which is owned by NatWest. They removed it. They lied about why they removed it. They briefed the BBC something which wasn't true. They then offered him a basic bank account with NatWest. He said, well, I want a business account. They said, we can't do that. He was then, I think, denied a bank account at 9 other banks, right? Now, I would have thought most people would think this is really bad, because today it's him, but tomorrow it's going to be me. It could be, if you have heterodox political views, you will be debanked. Well, you would think, well, the left has quite heterodox views given like how society functions right now. So it's in our rational self-interest to really care about this stuff. But lo and behold, like loads of people, university professors, top serious people, professional people, don't care.
Yeah, it's good. It's good because it's happened to him and I don't like it.
Yeah, but if it happened to me, that would be unacceptable.
Yeah, of course. No, I totally agree. You look back at the history of the professionals, the managers, and this idea of this humanist progressive ideology of, you know, the educated man. And that is somehow, I mean, people criticize the Aaron Rice and the PMC, but I think what's interesting is how it's
professional managerial class.
The professional managerial class, how that sort of ideology has sort of evolved. And I do think that there has been, I don't know if it was Brexit, there has been a sort of radicalization where people are speaking in terms which are deeply authoritarian, which is, I think, maybe a break, because there was historically it was perceived as we're more progressive, we're the most sort of the experts, and that was the tension with the bourgeoisie, was like, well, the bourgeoisie aren't running society efficiently. That's why you need us progressive technocrats to come in and run it sort of fairly in the interest of everyone. But I think, I totally agree. There has been a radicalization, and the stuff about due process I found terrifying just in general, in terms of the way society or online is going, in terms of people are unable to appreciate the fact, as you've said fairly consistently, that this stuff will be used against the left. I'm surprised it hasn't already, frankly. Well, it will be. Yeah. It all will be. And we're cheering on things because we think we don't like the person it's happening to. Is a really, it's a recipe for disaster, because obviously we're already there, really. We're already in a deeply authoritarian state. And it is interesting to see people who were traditionally seen to be like the upholders of liberalism have just totally abandoned the basic tenets of liberalism, like free speech, presumption of innocence, and so on and so forth. And if you look at Glenn Greenwald, most of his output is really just chronicling the sort of hypocrisy of the American professional managerial class. So they're sort of happy for people to be deplatformed or censored if it's people they don't agree with. But obviously if it happens to them, which it inevitably will, then it's terrible, which, I don't know, sometimes it makes me think, I feel like a proper liberal about this stuff, but these things are really important, and those foundational progressive liberal values about free speech and things like that are being forgotten and eroded by those managers. It's been cheered on by people who should know better. Like, this really came home to me with Novara Media, because YouTube removed our channel 18 months ago. And I had these views before, I hope. But that really brought home to me like how much arbitrary power is concentrated in so few people's hands. And it made my views on this really concrete. And I have to be fair to some people on the right, they were saying this is not acceptable. And I think we need to agree to a certain set of rules, like access to banking, where we have monopoly media outlets in big tech. Like, there should be a very high threshold from no platforming. I think Tommy Robinson on Facebook, he was guilty of incitement with that young Muslim boy. Of course he should be taken off Facebook. But that's the kind of threshold we're talking about, not somebody saying something which you might disagree with or might be distasteful, might be from the right or the left. And symptomatic of this is the Labour Party. They're again, some people who so far have disagreed with everything I said Farage. No, the Labour Party is the exact same dynamic. You have Jamie Driscoll, who's an elected mayor. He has a lot of power. He has more power over actual people than, Keir Starmer's an MP, but it's ballpark similar. He has a real role over lots of people's lives. And he's blocked from restanding as a mayor in the Northeast. It was previously North Tyne mayor, now it's mayor for the Northeast, will be the next role next year, because he was he shared a platform with Ken Loach, right? Terrible. And this stuff is, 5 years ago, this was Twitter. Yeah. 5 years ago, this was stuff that people would say on social media. Now it is part of the core ideology of like the British Labour Party. And you think, how the hell did this happen? Liberals have given up on liberalism. Like I said, the professional managerial class has totally given up on its claim to progressive values, which has been so core to it. And I think it has all come in the slipstream of Trump and Brexit. And look, the left,
you can't then make, and this is actually my criticism of Glenn Greenwald, you can't then make your politics like trigger the libs.
Yeah.
The PMC are all fucking idiots.
I get it though. I get it.
I totally get it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I say it, sort of laughing. But then you can't just have because obviously left politics is about class.
Yeah.
So you can't just have a politics which is like in response to the culture war stuff, saying you're fucking hypocrites and idiots, even if some of them are sometimes. But it's really frightening. And I think we have a sort of discourse right now, and the far right are the enemy. That is the problem, absolutely. You mentioned sort of similarities to the 30s. That is the problem. But like in the drift away from a democratic society and I think we are drifting away, by the way, from like democratic norms, big time, it's being cheer-led by people who apparently are part of our coalition.
Yeah, exactly. But I actually think that this is where the potential for a new coalition actually lies, is the libertarianism, and is it, my conclusion in the book is you have to sort of excise the professional managerial ideology. And I think to do that, you probably have to break with labourism entirely. But I don't see how you can have any form of coalition with the working class, with the petty bourgeoisie, as long as you have the sort of these essentially very authoritarian managerial people involved. It's impossible. And I think actually you could form a coalition around things like the libertarian value. Well, I don't say libertarian in the sort of American sense, but around classical liberalism, your right to free speech. And I think as a litmus test, that would actually put a lot of people off. We've lost sight of some of these core basic principles, but a lot of people actually still do believe in those things, in freedom of speech and against censorship. And it's totally one of the ways you can bring people together. It really is. And libertarianism I think, goes under the radar in the UK as a political tendency, because if you think of our history, we think of labourism, we think of the welfare state. Libertarianism is an American thing, but you alluded to it earlier. One of the reasons that the low middle classes and working class people rejected the EU and voted against the EU was because of basically libertarian principles, a rejection of bureaucracy, a rejection of sort of unelected power, and those are really important. Those are really important things. So if there is going to be a left that survives, it has to be liberal in that sense, and it has to be libertarian. It has to think about: are we on the side of the bureaucracy? Are we on the side of sort of an enlarged state, or are we on the side of people? And a lot of people don't like the sort of the nanny state. And one of the problems we've got to work out is how, because I'd assume, like me, my vision of a future is probably of a abundance, return to a lot of state spending and the welfare state. But there is possibly a tension there in that the old welfare state, which we sort of fetishize on the left, actually wasn't as popular as we think. If it was as popular, it wouldn't have been able to be dismantled by Thatcher.
Well, elements were popular. So the NHS, for instance,
the NHS were popular, but
public pensions, hugely popular. My God, try and get rid of those.
But the idea of the nanny state is something that we've and sort of paternalism is something we really have to be alert to. The assumption that we are on the side of the nanny state and we're sort of telling people what to do, and people, in a way, possibly that is a contradiction to how we do want a strong welfare state without having the sort of nanny and paternalism. But I don't know, surely it could work. But I do really think that thing you said about the idea of classical liberalism and the idea of sort of being able to say what you want, and those are things that could form the basis of a cross-class coalition. I really do think that, and I really think that we have losing sight of those core principles. And you do see it on the left all the time. You see it on Twitter. When we say it's like the PMC, you see a lot of leftist people are just like, yeah, this is good because it's happened to someone I don't like. It's incredibly short-sighted.
I'm siding with Coots, the bank literally to the monarch of this country.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And so we have to be aware of who we're siding with, I think, and what the precedents that these things are setting, and like fundamental these liberal principles are really important. They're really important in rolling back this sort of authoritarian tide that's coming in. But I don't know. Let's see what happens.
I think that's a great place to end on. Dan, thanks so much.
Top man, thanks for having me.